Over at the ABC, they have a regular media show called MediaWatch. It's been going on for years. It claims to be an objective media watchdog. It has a staff of about 10 or more, including a full-time presenter, to produce 15 minutes of television a week, at your expense, of course. They like to have a go at right-of-centre commentators and anything to do with News Corporation, including this station, the tabloid newspapers and the Australian newspaper, of course. Here they were last month, amplifying the words of a former journalist from the Australian criticising his old paper.
Award-winning reporter Tony Kosh, seen here with his old boss in 2008, rarely lets a week go by without giving the paper a savaging. And last week it was this, quote, screaming front-page headline that set him off, tweeting,
"Who would have thought this grubby, insignificant apology for a newspaper would beat up and make racist a tragic event like a murder? How much lower can they go? Just..."
And on they went. What was strange about this reference was that it failed to identify any political link or background for Kosh, even though he was the media manager for a Labor candidate at the federal election. He was involved in the vicious and desperate campaign to unseat Home Affairs Minister Peter Dutton in the Brisbane seat of Dickson, where Get Up, the unions and others supported Kosh's Labor candidate, Ali France. Obviously, Kosh and that campaign failed. But back during the election campaign, before polling day, when MediaWatch ran another Kosh spray at the Australian and News Corp newspapers, the ABC obviously thought that they needed to mention his political connection.
We should perhaps point out that Kosh is now volunteering for Labor in Peter Dutton's seat of Dickson.
Fair enough, they did the right thing then, but then why didn't they mention Kosh's politics last month? Does it not matter anymore? Is he suddenly a political eunuch? Interesting, isn't it? Still, back in May, after declaring he was working for the Labor campaign, MediaWatch also added some endorsements from two other former News Corp journalists.
We should perhaps point out that Kosh is now volunteering for Labor in Peter Dutton's seat of Dickson. But he was not alone. A tweet from Peter Logue, the Australian and Telegraph's chief political editor in the 1980s, called Kosh's criticisms spot on, while Paul Sivret, who left the Courier Mail last year, said it summed up his feelings to a T.
So there you have it. You get the idea. They were saying that Kosh now campaigns for Labor, but his strident criticism couldn't be too partisan, could it? Because two other former News Corp journalists were supporting him. Well, what MediaWatch didn't tell you was that Paul Sivret, after he left the Courier Mail, took a job with a union. And not just any union, but the Queensland branch of the CFMEU. Funny how the ABC would leave that bit out, isn't it? So what we actually had was a CFMEU official supporting criticism made by an ALP campaigner against the Murdoch media. Hold the presses. And what about the other journalist, Peter Logue? Well, the very day of the MediaWatch broadcast, he tweeted to Coalition Minister Matt Canavan, "Enjoy opposition impotence, Matt." Sounds pretty dispassionate, doesn't it? Later on, the day before the election, he responded to former Labor Minister Craig Emerson, who tweeted about the late Bob Hawke's wish to see a shortened Labor government. And Logue tweeted, "Wish will come true, Craig. It will be a good night for the country he loved." Well, apart from revealing Logue didn't pick the election right, it also showed his partisan loyalties, something he confirmed with a tweet on election day to the Labor candidate for Wentworth, Tim Murray. Logue said he'd be handing out in Cobargo in the electorate of Eden Monaro, but said he'd try to swing a few votes his old mate's way. Mike Kelly, the local Labor candidate, won't miss them, he said. MediaWatch has run some other less savage and less direct criticism of the Australian from other former News Corp employees. But in the case of Kosh, Sivret and Logue, it failed to mention Kosh's political link when they ran him last month after the election. And during the election, it failed to mention Sivret's union job or Logue's obvious partisanship. The impression MediaWatch tried to give was that esteemed former News Corp journalists were admonishing the Australian for a lack of objectivity. But what they had were three anti-coalition, pro-Labor former News Corp employees, one campaigning for Labor, one working for the CFMEU, and the other handing out and barracking for Labor. And surprise, surprise, they were all lashing out at News Corp for placing some scrutiny on Labor. Hold the front page. MediaWatch needs media watching, and we are here to help.